Microphones. All right. John Paul was born in New York and raised in England, and he currently lives in New York. Okay. John Paul has a degree in anthropology from Oxford University and a master's in economics from Columbia University. All right. He worked as an economist for the World Bank and also as a journalist throughout the Americas and Europe. Okay. His articles have appeared in many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Britain's Sunday Telegraph, and Colombia's El Espectador, to name a few. Okay. He is the author of The Sugar King of Havana, all right, The Rise and Fall of Julio Lobo, okay, Cuba's Last Tycoon, which he wrote in 2010. Okay, so please give John Paul a warm welcome. Right, so again, I'd like to welcome everyone here and also to our Britannico Live viewers. Okay? Right, now, this is like an interview. It's an interview format. Okay, so I'll be asking some questions and then we'll bring the microphone to you for your questions. Okay? So start thinking about your questions that you would like to ask John Paul about journalism, writing, economics, and also studying at university in the UK. All right, start thinking about your questions. Okay? Right, so let's start with some questions. Okay, so John Paul, welcome to Britannico. Okay, is this your first time or your first visit to Peru?
Well, first of all, just want to say thank you and thank all of you for coming here this evening. And I really look forward to hearing any questions you might have later on. And if you say it in so-so English, that's fine by me. I often speak in so-so Spanish or so-so Portuguese. The first time I came to Peru was the last time I was in Peru was in 2012, just after Humala became president. I interviewed him before he became president, and I never forget, he'd just been jogging, and we met in a small office. There were lots of soldiers around, because as you know, he was an army man, and everyone was addressing him as Comandante. And I said, Senor Humala, but I can't call you Comandante. And he said, why not? And I said, because I don't believe in politicians being called Comandante. And he very nicely, actually, and not many would do this, he said, well, just call me Mister. So I took that as a rather good sign, because at the time, everyone was very worried about Humala becoming president. And in the end, it didn't turn out quite as bad as people feared. He didn't turn out to be the Chavez monster. So that was the last time I was in Peru.
So could you tell us why you're here in Peru now?
So this time I'm here in Peru because there's a festival, a literary festival in Arequipa, which is run by an English organization called the Hay Festival. It's a very beautiful organization, and I'd encourage anyone to go. It's very intimate. The space between you, the audience, and the writers, and some very famous writers go. Mario Vargas Llosa will be there, but also Salman Rushdie and many others. And it's a very intimate occasion. And I would really recommend it. I don't often recommend things, but I really would recommend this one.
Right, well, let's start with some questions, shall we? Okay, so you have been a journalist for the World Bank and now for the Financial Times. So what do you think are the qualities needed to be a good journalist?
There are so many different types of journalist. And I can only speak for my part, but I'd say there are two qualities that I can think of. First of all, I like to put one word after another, which is to say I enjoy the process of writing. So that's the first point. And the second point really is to be a journalist is a privilege because you can go and see other tribes. What I mean other tribes, I mean coming to Peru and meeting you, going to Brazil and meeting Brazilians, going to Colombia and talking to politicians, going to Mexico and talking to criminals or Mexicans. That's what I mean by visiting different tribes. So to be curious, I think, really is an essential quality for a journalist. To be curious, and because I write, I'm a journalist and I write. There are other journalists who work in television or radio, but I write, so I enjoy just the process of writing, putting one word after another.
Okay, so I think you've just answered the next question. So what advice can you give our students who would like to be a writer and start writing articles and stories?
I think the first thing, if you want to be a writer, is to enjoy being a reader. And I had a vice for books. Reading was my vice as a child, as a way to escape in my imagination, to travel to other places, to travel to interior places. So reading is the first thing. And then the process of writing comes. Once you become a good reader, you're more likely to become a good writer. And I can remember my first article that I wrote. I thought I was 16 or so, and I thought I want to become a writer because it seemed like a good idea and I didn't have a clue. I didn't know what else I wanted to do. So I thought, well, writers write. I better start writing. So I wrote a review of a concert that I went to listen to, a rock concert. And I enjoyed it. It just came out really easy. And I sent it into the college magazine and they said, wow, we love this. And it was printed. So that was my first entry into writing. So really, reading and putting pen to paper or finger to keyboard.
Okay. Many of our students study at BRITÁNICO, all right, because they would like to study or work in the UK in the future. So what advice can you give them about the UK as a place to study and work?
The UK is a place to study and work. Well, I've spent most of my life working outside the UK, but I do work for the Financial Times, which is a British institution. And I would say the best of the British institutions, such as the Financial Times, there is an assumption of equality. Everyone is worth as much as everyone else. Whether you're the president or you're a secretary, you still have an intrinsic value. You might have a lower paid job or a less important job, but you're still valuable as a person. No one is looking down at you. So I think that kind of tolerance and sense of fairness is probably the best aspect of working for a British company or working inside Britain. I think the British often, sometimes fairly, have a reputation for being cold and reserved. But the coldness is just a shyness, often. And it's often said that it takes a long time to make a friend in England, but once you've made a friend in England, they become your friends forever. And it's different in the United States, where I'm living now, where it's very easy to make a friend. But I don't have the same feeling that my friends, some of my new friends in the United States, will be my friends forever. So I'd say those are two cultural differences that I notice.
All right, so let's get into a little bit of politics. Okay, corruption is one of the main problems in Latin America. So in a recent interview with our Nobel Prize winner, Mario Vargas Llosa, he told you that a corrupted democracy is better than a non-corrupt dictatorship. Do you agree with him?
Well, but we're all formed by where we grow up and the situations that we grew up in. And Mario Vargas Llosa, clearly the Fujimori dictatorship was really important for him. I don't think there is such a thing as a non-corrupt dictatorship. I think all dictatorships, almost by definition, are corrupt. Either they're corrupt because of the power has corrupted the dictator, or they're corrupt, and they're all corrupt because the dictator will rule by giving his friends and his family and his business associates business. That's the case with, say, the Odebrecht scandal, where money was handed out to politicians in return for favors. it is interesting that Odebrecht didn't really work in, well, it did actually have a very large project in Cuba. But there's less money in Cuba, so there was less corruption there. So I think what Vargas Llosa said is a really interesting idea, because we were talking about Mexico at the time. And I don't know how aware you are of Mexico, but it's a quasi-democracy. There are elections, but it's only recently a democracy. And the corruption there and the violence is extreme. And he was arguing that it's better to have an imperfect democracy than to have a perfect dictatorship, which was his famous description of Mexico, was it was a perfect dictatorship.
Okay, thank you. All right, so it's time for a question from the audience.
Well, before we get to that, I'd just like to add, on the way here, I thought corruption might come up, because it is such an important topic in Latin America at the moment. And I was thinking of some of the people I've met as a journalist over the past 10 years, and how many of them are in jail at the moment. And it's a surprising number. A lot of them are politicians, but not all of them. So it's amazing how high people can rise and how low they can fall afterwards. And that's true of Peru, of Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, to name a few.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I think we have a question from, Has anyone got the microphone? Yeah, okay. We're going to start with, Is there a microphone? Okay. Yeah. All right, here it comes. Yeah, that's okay. We've got time, so you can pop your hands down for a minute. Okay.
Just now you were talking about these countries, about Latin America, or like Brazil, Argentina, Peru. What do you think are the challenges we are going to face soon as countries, as Latin American countries? What do you think are the challenges that are coming?
Okay, so the question was, what challenges do South American countries face?
Are going to face in the near future?
In the near future. Well, I can think of 4 big challenges, obvious ones. At the beginning of this century, commodity prices, the price of copper, the price of gold, the price of silver, of soya, wheat, maize, oil, was very high. So at the beginning of the century, all of this region, South America, money sort of fell from the skies. And from 2013, those prices collapsed. So the region is having to live with less monies. It's having to do more with less. But expectations are still quite high. So that's the first point, I would say, is making do with less. The second point, I would say, is that's the macroeconomy, the so-called macroeconomy. In the microeconomy, I'd say the biggest challenge is corruption. And I think my view, which is not everyone's view, but my view is that what's happened in Brazil with the Lava Jato and the Odebrecht case is extremely important. This is the Department of Justice, the US Department of Justice, which doesn't usually exaggerate, called this the biggest corruption case ever. So just to put this in perspective, it's been huge for Peru and Brazil especially, but this is the biggest corruption case that the US Department of Justice has ever seen. So I think the fact that Marcelo Odebrecht, one of the richest men in Brazil, went to jail is extraordinary. If someone had said to me 3 years ago, or to any Brazilian, Marcelo Odebrecht will end up in jail, nobody would have believed him. And by the same token, perhaps it's extraordinary that Keiko Fujimori is now in jail here. I don't expect anyone here thought that she might, even though everyone knows that there's been corruption in the air for a long time. So I think the fact that very powerful people are going to jail shows that impunity, corruption will always happen. It's the question is if the people who are corrupt are then caught and put in prison or punished. I think that's a really important change. So the macroeconomy, the microeconomy and corruption. Then there are other factors like climate change. I was just up around Cusco in the Andes, so beautiful, but you see the glaciers there are receding. Over the past 10 years, they've receded, and that's a huge change. Climate change may be driving these migrant caravans that are going up through Mexico towards the US border, where Donald Trump has been talking so much about it. And the other fourth challenge is technology, the idea of artificial intelligence and what that means for jobs and less jobs being available. I work in an industry which has been really affected by technology, so I felt it extremely hard. So those are four big challenges. Two of them are for everywhere, and the climate change and technology, but two, the corruption and the macroeconomy, are more unique to South America.
Great, thank you. All right, there were some hands up there. Okay, so we...
My name is Pablo Oviedo. I am licenciated in tourism and business. So my question is, what do you think, could it be possible that Latin American economy be unified?
The question was whether I think the economy in Latin America will be fine.
That Latin America economy be unified, so that all the countries of Latin America maybe can have one coin, no? So that we can do commerce.
So the idea of an economic bloc, something like the European Union, or even like the United States, if you consider each of the US states as its own country. There have been so many attempts for that, 200 years of attempts to join South America. And what you have with the Pacific Alliance, the Alianza del Pacífico, is one example, and it's the one that's, I think, shown the most promise, because it's not based on politics. It's based on business and economics, and bringing down trade barriers, and making it easier to get visas, and easier to do business across borders. So I think those sorts of ideas show promise, but it'll be a gradual process, and it's not an easy one, as you see with the European Union, which worked very well, and now it's suffering. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, we've got another question, have we? Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Andrea, and my question is that you know that every country has a VCR, right? And my question is, if every country has it, why not making our own money?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
If every country has a VCR, why not making our own money?
If every country has a VCR?
Yeah. It's a central bank.
Okay. So every country has a central bank. Why doesn't every country make its own money? Is that the question? Yeah. Essentially, every country that has a central bank does make its own money. So let's take a really bad example. Venezuela. What a mess. There, the central bank just prints money. And inflation is reaching, the IMF reckons it will reach 1 million % this year. So that's more than the hyperinflation that was here in Peru under the first Alan Garcia government. And inflation in Peru, but in contrast, is 3%, something like that. So every country can print its own money if they have a central bank. The question is, how much money does a central bank print? And the more you print, the less it's worth. I hope that answers your question, Andrea.
Okay. All right. I'm just going to ask a question, and then we'll get back to you. Okay. Yep. All right. So we're talking about elections. Okay. So what is the economic path in Latin America now that in many countries the right has been elected? All right, like Chile, Brazil, and Guatemala.
Well, that's a big question. At the beginning of the century, with what I call the commodity boom, when prices were so high, the left was very powerful in Latin America. There was Cristina Fernandez in Argentina, Lula and Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, Chavez in Venezuela. Peru has always been a little bit of a special case. Chile, there was Bachelet. In Peru, there was Humala. And then the prices of commodities came down, and suddenly the governments had run out of money. And I think people were just fed up with the corruption that flourished during those years, and it happened to be that the governments were of the left. So they got thrown out, by and large, and the right came in. I don't see it as a swing all the way to the right. In most cases, it's a swing to the center. That seems to be what has happened in Peru. It's certainly what's happened in Chile and in Argentina. Brazil is the big question mark. What will Bolsonaro turn out to be like? Is he a good right, or is he a bad right? And there are people I would put in the bad right category. The presidents of Guatemala and Honduras, for example. And I would put Macri and Piñera in the good right. They're centrists. They're modern people. I don't think Orlando Hernandez and Jimmy Morales are modern people.
All right, so you were talking about Venezuela. I think we have a question about Venezuela.
Okay, so Peru has decided to support the Venezuelan people during this difficult time and what's going on with their country. And I wonder, what can you tell our students about Venezuela and its problem? Now that our students have much more contact with them every day and they know more about their problems. Thank you.
Okay, I'd be just curious to see how many in the audience have new Venezuelan friends, or people, or Venezuelans that they have met in the last 2 years. Okay, so half the room. Venezuela has a very special place in my heart. I lived there in the 90s, and I was working there as a journalist when Chavez was elected. And my son was born in Caracas. And my mother is Cuban. As you may be aware, Cuba and Venezuela are very close. They have very similar stories. The Venezuelan story has happened later than the Cuban story. And my mother was also in exile. And my family were dispersed by the revolution around the Americas. Some went to the United States, some went to Colombia, some went to Mexico, some went to Venezuela, some went to the UK, which is where I grew up. So when you have a revolution, and when the revolution doesn't work out, there's a huge diaspora. People go everywhere. And they're only, I'm sure, I was with, up in Machu Picchu, and they were in the restaurant there were Venezuelan waiters. And I recognized them as like the people I knew in Caracas. They were fine, they were normal people, you know, just people looking to make a better future for themselves. And it's extremely difficult, I understand, for the receiving countries. 2 million Venezuelans have left in the past 2 years. This is an exodus almost as big as Syria's. And I think Latin America has shown a much better response to Venezuelans than Europe has shown to the Syrians, or that the United States, for example, has shown to the Central Americans. So I understand the resentments and the bad feelings that can happen when Venezuelans come and maybe they take your jobs. In Barranquilla, for example, which is a town in Colombia, there's a mariachi band there which is Venezuelan, and they're out competing the local Colombian mariachi band. And you can understand the Colombians are really upset when these Venezuelan musicians, who are just as good as them, but much more desperate, and they're charging half the price. So it's a difficult situation, but you know, you have to show your heart, I think. And I think Pope Francis put it very well. There's no magic solution, but if you just hear their stories and open your heart to their stories, you can't help but, I think, be compassionate. And try not to think of it as 2 million people, but as a collection of 2 million individual stories.
Okay, so have we got any questions? Yeah.
Guido del Castillo, del Museo de Minerales Andrés del Castillo. This is a personal question. If you could give us details on the book you wrote, I think the name is Lobo, which I read it and it's very interesting, and I think the public would like to know the details. But I wanted also to add that Peruvian economy is based on minerals, and Peru is very important, even being a small country economically, but is a large producer of minerals. Is number 2 in production of copper. Is number 1 sometimes in production of silver, with fights the first place with Mexico, and it's number 1 and also in zinc, and as I remember, I think it's number 2 in copper after Chile, number 4 in lead, and number 4 also in molybdenum, and number 5 in gold. So this shows you that how important is the Peruvian economy and minerals. This has helped to a lot the economy, because the crisis has not hit that bad as Peru as it hit Brazil, which only produces iron. Well, thanks for the...
Okay, thank you, Guido. Three cheers for Peru.
Karina? Yeah, there's a question here. This girl's being very
I do
patient.
have, I'll take just 2 points on that, Guido. First, the book, just because it's my book and you might be interested.
Sorry.
It was about Cuba's richest man before the revolution. And he had quite a life. He went out with film stars, he was put against a wall to be shot, and he had an interview with Che Guevara, who wanted him to become sugar minister. So he had quite an extraordinary life, and if you want to learn about finance, and you want to learn about Cuban history, and you want to meet a lot of film stars, and have sex, drugs, and rock and roll, it's all there in 300 pages. Peru and its role as a mineral producer, absolutely, very important. And when you look back over the past 10 years at South America, and you look at the economic performance of the countries, what's remarkable about Peru is it just keeps on growing. 7%, 6%, 8%. At the moment it's growing 4% or so. And everyone in Peru is incredibly upset. 4%, oh my God, that's not A+, it's only B+. But it's still pretty good. And if you compare it to other countries like Colombia, which has got a similar kind of economy, Colombia's growing maybe 2 or 3. Brazil has had its worst recession ever. So Peru is very interesting how presidents come, presidents go, they end up in jail, they're impeached, whatever, and the economy just keeps on growing. And I think maybe the most important president in Peru is perhaps the president of the central bank, Julio Velarde. So that's my answer to your question, Guido.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, we have a question here. Okay. So,
Good afternoon. I would like to thank you first for having come to this side of the pond. I know it's very far, but you can see at all the young people who have come here to listen to you and to access this information, which we don't get really, usually. So I'm not a student of the Británico, but I'm still very thankful that they've done this. So my question to you is about the Brexit. It's been all over the news, at least in the past years. And for the ones who have been able to access information, and for the ones who haven't, I would like to ask you to explain to us a little bit, because I know it has had a lot of impact on the economy, and that's why it happened in the first place, right? Because some people weren't agreeing that it was good for the UK because they were giving too much to the European Union, and others were saying no. So could you explain us, because you are British, so you could tell us how did it actually impact on your economy and how it did and when it went good or bad? Thank you.
Okay. So I'd just like to say, it strikes me that everyone here has asked me a question, and that is great, because quite often in these conversations you don't get questions, you get a dialogue, and that has no question at the end. So first of all, congratulations to all of you for asking me questions. Now, this is a very difficult question, and there isn't really an easy answer to it. I think Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, perhaps, showed that things weren't as good as they seemed. And some people got the short straw, as they say in English. It will have a profound effect on the British economy if the UK leaves the European Union. That's without doubt. And the people who voted for Brexit, and I was not one of them, felt that what they gained in terms of sovereignty and the ability to write and legislate laws in the UK was worth being poorer. That was the idea. Whether that will actually happen, well, they will feel the same in 2, 3, 5 years is another matter. What will happen next is nobody knows. Literally nobody knows, because there is no plan. The process has been going on for 2 years, and still the British don't have a plan. And the way I view it, and the British, I think we can agree, are quite pragmatic, sensible people. The way I view it is Brexit is an emotional reality for many people in the country. And the European Union is a bureaucratic reality. What happens when an emotional reality meets a bureaucratic reality? The answer is it gets postponed. The solution gets postponed and postponed and postponed. And that's the situation we're in now.
Okay, well, you got another question? Yep, okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Yesenia. My question is, what is the Venezuela's current situation? How this affect our country, Peruvian?
So, thank you for your question. I've talked about how it might affect you and how you view Venezuelans. An economist would say if you get well-trained people coming into your country, that actually is an economic benefit. That is the economic argument for migration. Brexit is the political and emotional argument against migration. So I think you're going to have those two factors at work. On the one hand, good for the economy, although you may not think it. On the other hand, it could generate resentments, and I hope it won't.
Okay. Do we have another question here at the front? No? Okay. I think there were some questions about studying in the UK. Is that right? Yes, studying at Oxford University.
I can see lots of hands.
All right, yeah.
Going up and down,
Okay.
up and down.
Yep.
Not sure.
Don't worry. We'll be coming to you.
Okay. You are an alumni of Oxford University, one of the most prestigious universities in the UK and in the world. And what could you tell us about Oxford University, and what is your advice for young people who would like to study there? Thank you.
I'd say it's extremely beautiful city, and it's a privilege to be walking amongst so much history. It's a sort of like, to be silly, it's like as if Machu Picchu was a university. You know, you feel the history all around you, and yet it's absolutely modern and up to date. So it's a strange mix of old and new. There's a process to apply, and if you have the money to pay, because I think it's quite expensive for a foreign student, I think it's more expensive for a foreign student, one try. Also better education than in the United States.
Okay. All right. So we've got lots more questions. We have a lot more questions. Would someone like to ask a question? There were a few at the back there. Thanks, Karina.
Hi. What do you think Peru needs to grow up more?
Where do I think Peru needs to grow up more?
How?
Um,
How it needs to improve?
how to improve and to grow up more?
How should Peru develop more? I think one of the weaknesses in Peru is the civil service. How money is spent, basically. When I was last here in 2012, I did a lot of journeys through the interior in the mountains, and I noticed in each town there was a sculpture to a Wellington boot, a shrimp, a miner's hat. What else? They were ridiculous, basically. And it showed me, there were also a lot of new football pitches, and it showed me that there was a lack of imagination and ability to design projects and spend the money. And that was to do with lack of capability, lack of technical capability at the local level. So I would say that's an important area where Peru needs to develop more, is have a stronger civil service. I also noticed, just flying here to Lima this morning from Cusco, as I was checking in, there was a big screen with lots of photographs of people's heads. There were 2 columns, 2 rows. Below there were missing people, very sad stories. Above was all ex-alcaldes who were wanted for corruption charges. So I would say that's one area where Peru could probably improve, and it's not the only country that could do with the same.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, we've got some questions for our people, our viewers from Britannico Live. Welcome. Hello. Okay, so I'll be asking the first question. There are 3. How can Peru stop being a centralized country?
I think I've just answered that question.
Okay, so number 2. Okay, how do you think Brexit will affect relations between the UK and Peru?
Probably will help them, because Britain will be desperate for fast-growing countries that to become its new best friend.
All right, and do you think WikiLeaks is an appropriate investigative journalism? Is appropriate? Okay.
WikiLeaks.
Yeah, WikiLeaks.
Okay, Julian Assange is a pretty complicated character. As the Financial Times, we treated WikiLeaks as another source of information. A government is a source of information, a businessman is a source of information. WikiLeaks was a particularly rich source of information. So that's how we treated it. Was there an agenda behind WikiLeaks? Perhaps. That's to do with Julian Assange. Is it valuable to have information out into the public? Yes, I think it is. And WikiLeaks was one way in which that happened.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you, our Britannico Live viewers. All right, I think, well, are there any more questions? Yes? Okay.
This person here, she's got her hand going up and down.
Up and down,
So
okay.
I want to hear your
Your
question.
hand, can you put your hand up here? All right, okay. Yeah, the girl in the 3rd row, is that right? Okay, thanks, Karina. All right, can you just pop your hand up? Can you raise your hands, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Natalie, and I would like to know what would be your advice for people that in the future would like to work and live in the UK? Because I want to know how is the work for immigrants, like Latin American people. And that.
Okay. I don't know how Brexit will affect that, but there is strangely, there is a Latin American community in England, not a very big one, but there are a lot of Brazilians, there are a lot of Colombians, quite a lot of Peruvians too. Accommodation is expensive in London, so you might think of another city. I'm just suggesting there are lots of other places in England too, major cities. Think about what you would work at. Learn English, make your English better, sure. Get a job in a restaurant, maybe being waiting, or sure, that's all good. And you'd have a marvelous time. I think you'd have an amazing time. But if there's something else you want to do, then you have to think about how you would get that, and to make a strategy of how to do that. I don't know if that's helpful. But give it a go.
Okay, well, I've got one last question here. Okay, so do you think digital media is replacing traditional media? All right, recently in our country, digital media has been a key actor or factor reporting corruption cases.
Yeah, digital media, very important. And you see that throughout Latin America, where digital outfits in Colombia, Mexico, Peru, El Salvador, Brazil, they've all led on the corruption stories because they have much lower overheads, they can dedicate themselves to very narrow issues, and they can really go for it. So incredibly important. At the Financial Times, to answer the broader question, is digital media replacing old media? We see it inside ourselves, within the FT. We have 1 million subscribers, and 10 years ago, about 3/4 of our revenues came from print, and 1/4 came from digital. Today it's the other way around. 3/4 of our revenues come from digital, and 1/4 comes from print. So we're experiencing it ourselves within the organization. And for better or for worse, because it's not all for good, that's the way things are going towards the digital.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have time for one last question. Is that right? Okay, is there someone there with the microphone? Could you please stand up?
Hi, my name is Cesar. I am a Britannico student. And as you are a writer and a good reader, I want to ask you, do you think that socialism will work one day?
That's a good question. Do I think socialism will work one day? Well, to be frank, no, I don't. Because I say that on the basis of experience, and I haven't seen it work anywhere. But that doesn't mean that social democracy, like in Sweden, that could work. But I think you have to acknowledge that prices, the role of prices, which is basically information, a price is information, you have to allow prices to tell that information. There are some incredible books I recommend to you, and read it in Spanish, El hombre que amaba los perros, by a Cuban writer called Leonardo Padura. And that is about the death of Trotsky, and as told by his Spanish assassin who goes to live in Cuba. And it's basically about socialism, written by a Cuban writer living inside Cuba. So we could have this discussion again after you've read this book. It's a fabulous read, and you'll learn a lot about Trotsky, which is an incredible character, and you'll learn a lot about socialism too, by someone living inside a socialist country.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Okay.
Hi, my name is Andres. My question is, what would be your advice if I put my business here?
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Okay, what would be your advice if I put my business here?
What would be my advice?
Yes.
Are you Peruvian?
My dream is put my own business here or abroad, but I could be now. What is your advice for me?
Okay. The question is, what is my advice for a Peruvian making a business here in Peru? Yeah. Depends what your business is. I think if you're in mining, you're probably in a good place. Peru is growing at the moment 4%. But let's say its average growth over the past year 10 years is 6%. I mean, that means it doubles in size every 14 years. So it's better to set up a business in a fast-growing economy than in one that isn't growing. And if you know the economy and you know the country and your contacts are here, then by all means you should do it here. If you need capital, if you need investment, then you need to reach a certain size and you'll get capital here, and then maybe you can get it from abroad later on. And that's where England and Peru becoming best friends after Brexit may help you.
All right, we have another question? Yeah.
Good afternoon, I'm Guillermo. Is a good idea invest in Bitcoins in Peru?
I'm not a fan of Bitcoin, and I'm not a fan of e-currencies. So I think it's just speculation. I don't think it's investment. The difference between investment and speculation is trying to make money and often losing it, and investment is basically about conserving money.
Okay, good question. Is there another question? Okay, great. Would you like to stand up?
Okay, my name is Dylan, and my question is, if you were a president here in Peru, what would you do with the government?
What would I do with what?
With the government.
If I was president, what would I do with the government?
Here in Peru.
If I was, and it was my government, or someone else's? Okay, so it's my government. I'm president, and it's my government. I would try to run it as well as possible. But I don't think I'd ever be a very good president. I think it's a terrible job. Everybody hates you.
Okay. Karina, have we got time for any more questions? Or will we...
Yeah,
One more? Is there one more
question from Britannico Live. Do you agree that Latin American countries should focus more on economic growth rather than human resources in order to decrease poverty statistics?
I think the question is, should Latin American governments focus more on economic growth than human rights? Yeah. I mean, I'm a liberal in the English tradition, and the two are, you can't separate the two. Economic rights and human rights are the same. Economic rights are part of human rights. I do think sometimes in Latin America there is an overemphasis on human rights in the letter of the law, and not enough recognition of what it actually means in practice. It's like saying tomorrow will be a sunny day, but that doesn't always mean that tomorrow will be a sunny day. So I think a lot of it is talk, unfortunately, the respect for human rights. And after a dictatorship, be that in Peru or Argentina and Chile, obviously it's fundamentally important that basic human rights are respected, especially the rule of law, and property rights. But that's only the beginning.
Okay, well, that's all we have time for today. Okay, so I would like to thank you all for coming. Okay, and it's been wonderful. All right, it's such a thought-provoking session. And you've had some really interesting questions, so thank you. All right, and thank you to John Paul, all right, for your valuable time. Okay, and we really appreciate you coming today. Okay,
thank you very much.
So thank you once again. All right, so everybody have a lovely evening. Okay, and we hope to see you for the next one.
Thank you very much for
Take
coming.
care.